The reservation was supposed to be for two. That was the part that kept replaying in Ava's mind as the hostess at Miravel led her through the restaurant with that particular kind of smile. The one that said, "I know, honey, and I'm sorry," without a single word being spoken out loud. The table was in the back corner, near the window that overlooked Michigan Avenue, and it had a small candle in the center and 2 sets of silverware already laid out. Ava sat down, placed her clutch on the empty chair across from her, and unfolded her napkin with steady hands. She was proud of the steady hands. She had gotten ready for 2 hours. The dress was deep burgundy, fitted at the waist, the kind of dress you wear when you want someone to remember you. Her hair was down, long and dark, brushed until it caught the light the right way. She'd even worn the gold necklace, thin, delicate, pressed flat against her collarbone, that she never wore to regular dinners because it felt like too much. Tonight she had wanted too much to be exactly right. Marcus had texted at 6:47 p.m. She'd been in the Uber. "I can't do this anymore, Ava. I think you know that." That was it. No call. No further explanation. 7 words and a period at the end, like a door being closed quietly, almost politely in her face. She ordered a glass of Pinot Noir and asked the waiter to remove the second set of silverware. He did it without making it weird, which she appreciated more than she could say. She opened the menu and stared at it. The words didn't arrange themselves into anything meaningful for a while. Miravel was the kind of restaurant that existed in a different register from ordinary life. It was housed inside the Aldwyn Hotel on the 13th floor, all dark wood paneling and low amber lighting, with tables spaced far enough apart that you could have a private conversation without lowering your voice too much. It was the kind of place where the glasses were so thin they seemed fragile, where the bread arrived warm and wrapped in cloth, where everything moved at a pace that suggested time itself had agreed to slow down for the evening. Ava had suggested it because Marcus always complained that she never planned anything. She had planned this down to the reservation, the table by the window, the restaurant week menu she'd pre-selected. She had planned all of it, and he had ended it in 7 words from somewhere she wasn't. She drank half the wine before the bread arrived. The restaurant was full but not loud. Couples, mostly. A group of men near the front in dark suits that looked expensive and deliberately understated. A woman celebrating something with 2 friends. A bottle of champagne sweating in a silver bucket beside them. Ava watched them for a moment, the way one of them threw her head back, laughing, completely unself-conscious, and felt something small and sharp move through her chest. She looked back at the menu. She would order. She would eat. She would pay and leave, and she would not cry in this restaurant because she had spent 31 years building the kind of composure that held in public, and she was not going to let Marcus, who couldn't even call, who had sent 7 words in a text, take that from her tonight. She ordered the salmon. She ordered another glass of wine. She sat with her back straight, and her expression neutral, and she was doing fine. Genuinely fine. Until the noise in the restaurant shifted. It was subtle. Not a silence exactly, more like a held breath. A change in the quality of the air, the way conversations didn't stop but seemed to pull inward, become quieter and more careful. Ava noticed it the way you notice a drop in temperature. Not dramatically, just a sudden awareness that something had changed without you seeing it change. She looked up. He came in from the private elevator near the back, the one she'd assumed was for staff. There were 4 men with him, broad-shouldered, unhurried, scanning the room with the particular blankness of people who are paid to be invisible while missing nothing. But they were not what caught her attention. He was tall, taller than she expected, given how quietly he moved. Dark suit, no tie, the collar of his white shirt open at the throat, and she could see from where she sat the edge of something dark, inked along his neck, disappearing beneath the fabric. His hair was pushed back from his face, and his face was... She searched for the right word, and couldn't find one that felt accurate. Composed, maybe. Not handsome in the way that needed your attention. handsome in the way that simply existed and let you deal with it. He moved through the restaurant and the room accommodated him. That was the only way to describe it. Tables didn't move and people didn't scramble, but somehow there was space for him in every direction, and the maitre d' appeared from nowhere with the practiced urgency of someone who had been quietly waiting. They exchanged a few words. The man's eyes moved once across the room, a single slow survey, and Ava looked down at her salmon. She had no reason to keep watching. She looked down and cut into her fish and chewed and tasted nothing. The feeling of being watched arrived before she understood what it was. It was pressure, faint and specific, like a hand just barely not touching the back of her neck. She resisted for a moment, then looked up again. He was seated now, at a table diagonally across from hers, closer than she'd realized. And he was looking directly at her, not in the way men sometimes looked at women in restaurants, that sliding, assessing look that moved on quickly when it was noticed. This was still, patient, the kind of look that didn't apologize for itself. Ava held it for 2 seconds, then glanced away. Her wine glass was empty. She didn't remember finishing it. She was reaching for her water when she heard movement, and then, without warning, without introduction, the chair across from her pulled back, and someone sat down. Not a waiter, not Marcus, not anyone she had ever seen before tonight. He sat the way he had walked into the restaurant, like the space had been built for him, and he was simply confirming it. Up close, the ink on his throat was intricate, layered, shapes folding into other shapes. His hands rested on the table, still, and he looked at her with an expression that gave away almost nothing. For a moment, Ava genuinely could not speak. Not from fear exactly, though fear was there somewhere underneath, but from the sheer strangeness of it, the absolute calm he projected while doing something that was objectively not calm at all. "I think you have the wrong table," she said. Her voice came out even. She was grateful. He didn't answer immediately. He looked at her for a beat too long, then glanced once toward the front of the restaurant, something shifting briefly in his expression. Barely, like a shadow crossing a wall. When he looked back at her, he leaned forward slightly, just slightly. "There are 3 men near the entrance," he said, his voice low and unhurried. "They came in after me and they are not here for the food." A pause. "I need you to act like you know me. For the next hour." Another pause, shorter. "Please." Ava stared at him. And then he said the thing that would replay in her mind for weeks afterward. The thing she would never quite be able to explain or reduce to logic when she tried to describe this night to herself. "Tonight, you're my wife." The candle between them flickered once, though there was no draft she could feel. Ava did not say yes. She did not say no. She sat completely still and looked at this stranger across her table for one. This man who moved rooms without touching them, whose neck was covered in ink, and whose eyes had not left her face since he sat down. And she felt, beneath the wine and the grief and the steadiness she'd been maintaining all night, something she hadn't expected. Curiosity. Pure, sharp, and entirely against her better judgment. She didn't move for 3 full seconds. Then slowly, she set her fork down against the edge of her plate. The small, precise sound of it felt enormous in the quiet between them. And she folded her hands in her lap and looked at him the way she looked at difficult clients at work, the ones who came in with unreasonable requests and expected her to simply absorb them. "Your wife," she repeated. "Yes. You don't know my name." Something moved at the corner of his mouth, not quite a smile, more like an acknowledgement. "No," he said, "and I don't know yours." "Hakjin." He said it without ceremony, like handing her something small and functional. "You can call me Jin if that's easier." Ava glanced toward the entrance. She tried to do it naturally, the way someone might look up simply because a draft came through, not because a stranger had just told her there were dangerous men near the door. She saw them immediately, 3, as he'd said, standing apart from the waitstaff, not looking at menus, not looking at each other. Looking at the room with the same flat patience she now recognized from the men who had come in with Hakjin, except these men didn't have it quite as polished. There was something tighter in the way they held themselves, something impatient underneath the stillness. She looked back at Hakjin. "What happens if I say no?" she asked. "Nothing happens to you," he said immediately, and the speed of it, the fact that he'd anticipated the question, should have unsettled her more than it did. "You finish your dinner and you leave, and tonight becomes a strange story you tell eventually. And you?" He didn't answer that. He just looked at her, and somehow the not answering told her exactly what she needed to know about the stakes involved. Ava breathed in once through her nose. She thought about Marcus's text. She thought about the 2 hours she'd spent getting ready for a dinner she'd eaten alone. She thought about the empty chair and the second set of silverware being quietly removed, and the waiter who'd done it without making it weird, and how that small kindness had almost broken her when nothing else had. "Ava," she said. He looked at her. "My name. You said you didn't know it." For the first time, something shifted in his expression beyond the controlled neutrality. Not warmth exactly, but a kind of attention that was different from what had been there before. More focused. "Ava," he said, and the way he said it, low and unhurried, like he was placing it somewhere careful, made her press her hands flatter against her thighs. "1 hour," she said. 1 hour. "And you don't touch me." A pause. "Agreed. And after, you let me finish my dessert in peace." This time it was a real expression, brief, genuine, something almost like surprise softened quickly into something quieter. "Agreed," he said again. She reached for her water glass, took a sip, set it back down. "Then sit like you know me," she said, "because right now you're sitting like we just met, and that's going to be obvious." He shifted. It was a small adjustment, shoulders dropping a degree, the angle of his body turning slightly toward her, one hand moving from the table to rest nearer to her side of it. But the effect was immediate. He went from being a stranger who had sat across from her to something that looked, from a distance, like a man settled into the specific comfort of a person he had chosen to be near. It was almost unsettling how quickly he did it. Almost. A waiter appeared. Hakjin ordered without looking at the menu, something in a low voice that Ava didn't catch, and then he looked at her glass and said, "Another Pinot?" And she blinked, because she hadn't mentioned what she was drinking. "How did you—" "The color. And you've had 2. A pause. "Unless you'd prefer something else." "Pinot is fine," she said, and hated how small her voice came out. The waiter disappeared. The restaurant resumed its low hum around them, and Ava kept her posture careful and her hands visible on the table, because she was acutely aware that she was performing something she had never rehearsed, and that there were men near the front door watching the room for inconsistencies. She didn't look at them again. She kept her eyes on Hakjin or on the window, where the lights of Michigan Avenue moved below them in the dark, like something slow and continuous and indifferent. "You came alone tonight," he said. It wasn't a question. Obviously. The dress wasn't for alone. The bluntness of it landed somewhere tender, and Ava felt the sting before she could decide not to. She kept her face even. "No," she said. "It wasn't." He didn't push further. He didn't offer the kind of empty sympathy that people offered in these situations, the reflexive his loss, or you look beautiful anyway that felt like being handed a Band-Aid for something that needed more than that. He just let the fact sit there between them, acknowledged and undressed, and somehow that was better. Somehow that was the most respectful thing anyone had done for her all evening. The wine arrived. She drank some. Hakjin had ordered water, and whatever he'd said to the waiter hadn't materialized yet, and he seemed unbothered by this, or by anything. Which she was beginning to understand was simply how he existed in the world. "Can I ask you something?" she said. His eyes moved to her. "Those men." She kept her voice low, her lips barely moving, her expression pleasant. "Are they going to stay there all night?" Hakjin's gaze moved toward the entrance, just briefly, with the casual quality of a man simply looking around a room. When he looked back, something had resolved in his expression. "No," he said. "They're confirming. Once they're satisfied, they'll leave." "Satisfied with what?" "That I'm occupied." A pause. "That I'm not a threat to approach right now." Ava considered this. Because a man having dinner with his wife is less threatening than a man having dinner alone. Because a man having dinner with his wife is not a man who wants to be interrupted, he said. And the way he said wife, quietly, without weight, like it was simply a word, sent something through her that she chose not to examine. She turned toward the window instead. The city below was doing what it always did, moving without caring who was watching, enormous and indifferent, and lit up anyway. She had lived in Chicago for 6 years, and she still sometimes forgot how big it was until she saw it from above. "You do this often?" she asked. "Sit down at strangers' tables?" "No." "But you're very calm for someone who apparently needs to not be found." He looked at her. "Panic is a waste of time." She almost laughed. It surprised her, the almost laugh, and she covered it by taking another sip of wine. But she felt his attention sharpen slightly, felt him notice it, and she found she didn't entirely mind being noticed by him, which was something she decided to file away and deal with later, much later, when she was home and alone and back inside her regular life. One of the men near the entrance said something to the others. Ava tracked it in her peripheral vision without turning her head. There was a short exchange, and then, with the same unhurried quality they'd come in with, all three moved toward the door and were gone. The room breathed differently after that. Subtly, incrementally, the tension that Ava hadn't fully realized she'd been carrying in her jaw and shoulders began to release. Hakjin watched them leave. Then he looked back at her. "Thank you," he said. The 2 words were simple, but he said them the way he said everything, without excess, without softening. And somehow that made them mean more than if he'd elaborated. Ava nodded once. She looked at her plate, then at the empty chair that was no longer empty, then back at the window. Below them, the city moved and glittered, and she thought distantly that this was the strangest dinner she had ever sat through, and probably also the most alert she had felt in months, maybe longer. "You still have 40 minutes, she said. He settled back slightly in his chair, and for the first time since he'd sat down, he seemed like something less than a man managing a situation. Just a man. At a table, across from her. "I know," he said. And neither of them spoke for a moment, and it wasn't uncomfortable. That was the part that should have worried her more than anything else. That the silence between her and this stranger, this man whose name she had learned 6 minutes ago, felt less hollow than the one she'd been sitting inside all evening. The 40 minutes didn't feel like 40 minutes. That was the thing she kept coming back to afterward, when she was trying to make sense of the night in the quiet of her apartment, her heels abandoned at the door and the burgundy dress hanging over the back of her chair. Time had moved differently at that table, not slowly, not the way bad evenings stretch themselves out into something unbearable, but densely, like each minute had more inside it than usual. He asked her what she did. She told him she was a contracts manager for an architecture firm downtown, and he listened the way people rarely listened, without preparing his response while she was still talking. She mentioned almost accidentally that she'd wanted to be an architect herself once, had started the program and stopped halfway through for reasons that still felt complicated to explain, and he didn't ask her to explain them. He just said, The managing still keeps you close to it. And she had looked at him and thought, yes, actually, that's exactly it. And she wasn't sure anyone had ever articulated that to her before, not even herself. She didn't ask him what he did. It seemed unnecessary and also, she suspected, not a question he would answer straightforwardly. She understood by then that Hakjin operated in a space where direct questions about the shape of his life were not part of ordinary conversation. And strangely, sitting across from someone whose world she couldn't map felt less dangerous than it should have. Maybe because everything about him was so controlled, so deliberate, that it paradoxically suggested safety. Not the safety of openness, but the safety of someone who never did anything without knowing exactly what he was doing. At some point, his food arrived and he ate with the same economy he did everything. And she found herself watching his hands without meaning to. They were still on the table when he wasn't using them, and she thought about the men near the entrance who were now gone, and about whatever threat they represented, and about the fact that those same still hands were apparently capable of things she probably didn't want to think about too specifically. She thought about it anyway. When the waiter came to clear their plates, Hakjin ordered dessert for her without asking. The chocolate tart, which was exactly what she'd been considering. And she opened her mouth to say something about not needing him to order for her, and then closed it because the waiter was already gone, and also because, honestly, it was the right choice. And she resented slightly how much she didn't mind. "You read the menu when you were sitting alone," he said, answering the question she hadn't asked. "You looked at the dessert section twice. You were watching me before you came over." "Yes." The directness of it. No deflection, no performance of innocence. Just yes, plain and uncomplicated. As if watching her from across a restaurant was something that simply happened, and he saw no reason to pretend otherwise. "That doesn't bother you?" she asked. "Admitting that?" He considered her for a moment. "Would you prefer I pretended I hadn't?" "Most people would. Most people waste energy on pretending." Ava turned her wine glass slowly between her fingers. Outside, the city had deepened into full night, and the window reflected the restaurant back at them faintly. Two people at a small table with a candle between them, looking, from that angle, remarkably like exactly what they were pretending to be. "The hour is almost up," she said. Something crossed his face. Brief, contained. "I know." She had meant it as a neutral observation, but it landed between them as something else. And she felt it, and she suspected he did too. And neither of them addressed it directly, which was somehow its own kind of acknowledgement. The chocolate tart arrived. It was exactly as good as she'd hoped. She ate it slowly, and Hakjin drank his water and looked out at the city, and the comfortable silence between them continued. And Ava kept waiting for it to become awkward, and it simply didn't. She was on her last bite when his phone, which had been face down on the table since he sat, buzzed once. He looked at it. His expression didn't change in any dramatic way, but something in the set of his shoulders shifted, tightened by a degree, and she felt it. "Problem?" she asked. He looked up. Something moved in his eyes. Assessment. She was beginning to recognize it. The brief internal calculation before he decided how much to offer. "A development?" he said. That sounds like a polished word for problem. The corner of his mouth moved. It might be. She finished the tart. She set her fork down. She looked at him across the candle, which had burned lower now, and she thought about standing up and gathering her clutch and walking to the elevator, and going back to her apartment, and her empty closet, and the draft of a text she'd started to Marcus and deleted twice. She thought about how the evening had begun, and how completely it had turned into something she had no category for. "I should go," she said. "Yes," he said, but he didn't move, and neither did she. A beat. 2. Ava. The way he said her name still did something she couldn't normalize. "There's a car waiting downstairs. I'd like it to take you home." She blinked. That's not necessary. It's late. I'll get a cab. I'd like it to take you home, he said again, and the repetition was quiet, but it had weight to it, the kind of weight that didn't raise its voice because it didn't need to. She understood instinctively that this was what his authority looked like up close. Not a command. A statement made with such certainty that arguing against it felt like arguing against gravity. She should have argued anyway. She knew that. She was a 31-year-old woman who had been managing her own life and her own transportation for years, and she did not need a man, especially not this particular category of man, arranging her safe passage home like she was something that needed to be delivered carefully. "If I take your car," she said slowly, "what does that mean?" He looked at her. "It means you get home safely. That's all?" A pause. Deliberate. "That's all I'm offering tonight." The tonight sat in the air between them. She heard it. She was certain he knew she heard it. She reached for her clutch. She pushed back her chair and stood, and he stood at the same time. Automatic, immediate, the kind of reflex that came from somewhere older than conscious decision. And they stood across the small table from each other, and the candle was very low now, nearly gone. "Thank you for dinner," she said, "even though you weren't invited to it. Thank you for the hour." A pause. "Even though I wasn't invited to it." She almost smiled. She kept it just on the edge of her expression and turned toward the exit, and she was 3 steps away when she heard him say her name one more time, low enough that only she could have caught it. She stopped. She didn't turn all the way around. Just enough. "The man who stood you up tonight," Hakjin said, and his voice was even and quiet, completely without performance, "made a significant mistake." Ava stood still for a moment, with that sentence settling over her, and she felt it land somewhere beneath her sternum where the sharpest part of the evening had been living since 6:47 p.m. She didn't respond. She didn't know what to do with it except carry it, so she carried it. She walked to the elevator. The car was indeed waiting. Black, unmarked, a man in a dark jacket holding the door without being asked. She got in. The seat was warm. The city moved past the windows in long amber streaks as they headed north toward her neighborhood, and Ava sat in the back of a stranger's car in a dress she'd worn for someone who hadn't shown up, and felt, beneath everything, something she hadn't expected to feel tonight. She felt seen, not fixed. Not rescued, not handled. Just observed, accurately, by someone who had no reason to pay that kind of attention, and had done it anyway. She got home. She paid for nothing, because there was nothing to pay. She stood in her hallway in the dark for a moment before turning on the lights, the gold necklace still cool against her collarbone, and she thought about Hakjin's face across the candlelight, and the way the restaurant had held its breath when he walked in, and the particular quality of his voice when he said her name. She put her phone on the counter. Marcus's text was still there. Still 7 words, still ending with that polite and devastating period. She didn't delete it that night. But she didn't read it again either. She didn't expect to hear from him again. That was the reasonable assumption, the one that made sense when she reconstructed the night in daylight. A stranger had needed cover, she had provided it, a car had taken her home, and that was the complete shape of the thing. A strange story she could tell eventually, just like he'd said. She went to work on Monday with that framing intact, and it held for approximately 4 days. On Thursday, there was a single white orchid on her desk when she arrived. No card, no note. Just the orchid in a thin glass vase, already watered, placed exactly in the center of the empty space to the left of her keyboard, where she sometimes put her coffee. Ava stood in the doorway of her office for a moment, coat still on, bag still on her shoulder, and looked at it. She asked the front desk. The receptionist, Brianna, said a courier had dropped it off before 8. No name, no company, no return address on the packaging. Ava sat down. She looked at the orchid. She worked. She did not allow herself to spend more than a reasonable amount of time thinking about who had sent it, which meant she thought about it consistently in the background of everything else she did for the entire day, like a low frequency she couldn't quite tune out. Friday. Nothing. Saturday. Nothing. By Sunday, she had nearly convinced herself it had been a coincidence, some misdelivered arrangement intended for someone else in the building, when her phone rang from a number she didn't recognize. She almost didn't answer. She answered. Ava. His voice was exactly as she remembered it, low and unhurried, carrying that same quality of absolute certainty about being heard. Are you free Tuesday evening? She sat up straighter, which was a reflex she immediately found annoying. She was at home in her living room in a sweatshirt. There was no reason to sit up straighter. How did you get this number? A brief pause. I have access to certain information. That is not a reassuring answer. No, he agreed. It isn't. She pressed her lips together. Outside her window, the Sunday street was quiet, gray, the kind of Chicago late October that felt like the city was settling into itself for a long winter. Tuesday for what? Dinner. A pause. A real one this time. One you know about in advance. She should have said no. She was aware of this clearly and completely, the way you're aware of a step being slippery before you take it anyway. She knew what Hakjin was. Not specifically, not in documented detail, but in the way you know the nature of a weather system by the pressure drop that comes before it. She knew the orchid had not come from a man with a simple life. She knew the men near the entrance at Miravel had not been a one-time complication, but a feature of his existence, recurring and ongoing. She said yes. Tuesday was Italian, a small place in River North that wasn't listed on any of the apps she knew, accessed through a door off an alley that required knowing to look for it. There were maybe 12 tables. The owner greeted Hakjin with the kind of familiarity that came from years, not visits, and found Ava's eyes and smiled at her with what she could only describe as warmth, mixed with mild relief, as if her presence specifically was a good sign. There were no men near the entrance this time. There were 2 men at a table by the door, eating, saying nothing, who were with Hakjin without appearing to be, and Ava noticed them and didn't comment, and he noticed her noticing and didn't comment either, and that mutual silence felt like an agreement. He was different at this dinner. Not unguarded. She was beginning to think unguarded might not be a mode he possessed, but less managed somehow. Less like a man strategically occupying space, and more like a man who had decided to be somewhere and was simply being there. He asked her about the architecture program she'd left. She found herself talking about it longer than she'd intended, about the professor who had told her she had good instincts and poor patience, about the semester she'd withdrawn, and how she'd told everyone it was financial, and it was partly that, but not entirely. He listened. He asked one question at a time, carefully, the kind of questions that opened things rather than closing them, and she talked and ate and drank a single glass of red wine and felt, progressively, like someone was slowly turning up the light in a room she'd been navigating in the dark for a while. He told her things too. Not about the architecture of his life, not the parts she understood she was not supposed to ask about, but about smaller things that turned out not to be small. He had grown up in Koreatown in Los Angeles, the second of 3 sons. His mother had wanted him to play piano, and he had been genuinely terrible at it, and she had made him continue for 4 years anyway, because she believed suffering through something you were bad at built character. He said it without bitterness, almost with affection, and Ava looked at his hands resting on the table and thought about a younger version of those hands, still, forced onto piano keys, and felt something in her chest soften in a way she wasn't prepared for. Are you close with her? Your mother? Something moved across his face. She passed, 3 years ago. I'm sorry. He nodded once, accepting it without deflecting, and the gesture was so simply human that she had to look at the table for a moment. They walked after. She hadn't expected that, hadn't expected him to be a person who walked. But he stood when she stood at the end of the meal and said, "There's a route along the river if you're not cold." And she was a little cold, but she said fine. One of the men from the table by the door fell into step behind them at a discreet distance, and she became aware of Hakjin positioning himself on the street side of the sidewalk, her toward the buildings, without making any visible decision to do it. "You just did that," she said. "Did what?" "Moved to the outside, without thinking about it." He glanced at her. "I did think about it." "You didn't look like you thought about it." "That's different from not thinking." The river was dark and wide on their left, the bridges lit from below, the wind sharp off the water. Ava had her coat buttoned and her hands in her pockets, and she walked beside Hakjin on a Tuesday night in October, feeling like she was inside a life that didn't entirely belong to her yet, that she was borrowing it temporarily and would have to give it back. "Hakjin." She said his name carefully. "What is this?" He looked straight ahead for a moment. She waited. "I don't know yet," he said. "That's honest. I try to be, with things that matter." She let that sit. The river moved beside them, cold and indifferent, and somehow comforting in its constancy. She thought about Marcus again, briefly, and the thought had less sharpness than it used to. It had been 2 weeks. She hadn't answered his follow-up text. There had been a follow-up, 3 days later, softer, more explanatory. The kind of message people sent when they wanted to feel better about having sent the first one. She'd read it twice and put her phone down. "There's something I need you to understand," Hakjin said. He had stopped walking. She stopped too, and turned to look at him, and his face in the light off the water was serious in a way that was different from his usual composure. More exposed somehow. "The life I have, it has a weight to it. I don't want to put that on you without you knowing." Ava looked at him. "I'm not naive about what you are. I know you're not. That's why I'm saying it." A pause. Knowing about something and living near it are different things. "Are you warning me away?" He held her gaze. "I'm being honest about what close to me looks like." She stood on the riverside in the cold and looked at this man who had sat down at her table, uninvited 3 weeks ago, and sent her an orchid and made her talk about the life she'd half abandoned and walked on the street side of the sidewalk without being asked. And she thought about the weight he was describing and whether she had the capacity to hold it. She didn't know. She genuinely didn't know. "I'll think about it," she said. He nodded. That was all. He didn't push, didn't leverage, didn't soften the thing he'd said, to make it easier for her to dismiss. He had put the truth on the table, and he was leaving it there for her to decide about. And she found she respected that, more than almost anything he'd done. The walk back was quiet. At her street he said goodnight, and she said goodnight, and the car appeared and she got in. And she pressed her forehead against the cold glass of the window, and watched the city pass, and thought about weight and proximity, and what it meant to choose something with your eyes open. She thought about it for 3 days. She called him on Friday morning. Not texted, called, because it felt like the kind of thing that deserved a voice. He answered on the second ring, which told her he'd been awake, which told her nothing she could do anything with except note it. She said she'd thought about what he told her by the river. He said he remembered. She said she wasn't walking away, and the silence that followed was brief but full, the kind of silence that meant something had been received and held carefully. "Dinner Sunday," he said. "Dinner Sunday," she agreed. That was how it began, properly, with intention on both sides. November came in cold and certain, and Ava moved through her weeks at the office and her evenings with Hakjin, and tried not to measure how quickly the second thing was becoming the part of her days she oriented toward. It wasn't reckless, what she felt. It was too clear-eyed for reckless, too aware of its own edges. But it was real, and it grew the way real things grew, without asking her permission first. She met his world in increments. Not the full weight of it, not at once, but in small, deliberate introductions that she understood were carefully managed. A dinner at a private room in a hotel in the Gold Coast, where 3 other men were present, men who stood when she entered and whose eyes moved to Hakjin for a half-second before settling into something neutral, and she understood she was being registered, filed, assigned a meaning within a structure she couldn't fully see. A car that appeared outside her office on a Thursday evening when she'd mentioned offhandedly that she was working late, the driver holding a coffee from the place 2 blocks from her apartment that she'd never told Hakjin about. When she asked how he knew her order, Hakjin looked at her with that expression she had learned was the closest he came to sheepish. "You mentioned it once. The oat milk." "I mentioned it once. I pay attention." She had stood in the cold outside her building, holding the coffee, and felt simultaneously charmed and unnerved, because that was the nature of being close to someone like him. The same quality that made him precise and observant and genuinely caring was also the quality that made the world around him a place where nothing went unnoticed, and that cut in more than one direction. The unnerving part arrived properly in December. She had gone to meet a friend in Wicker Park, an easy Saturday afternoon, lunch and a walk through the market. On her way back to the train, a man fell into step beside her, not aggressively, casually, the way someone might if they were heading the same direction, except he wasn't heading anywhere. He said her name. He said it new and deliberately, the way you said a name when you wanted the person to understand that knowing it was itself a message. She stopped walking. "Tell Jin," the man said, still casual, hands in his jacket pockets, looking straight ahead, "that the conversation he's been avoiding needs to happen before the new year." He was gone before she could respond, folding back into the foot traffic of the market, as if he'd never stepped out of it. Ava stood on the sidewalk with her heart going and her hands very still at her sides. And she did what she had learned to do in the months since she'd said yes to all of this. She breathed, she assessed. She did not panic in public. Then she got in a cab instead of the train, and she called Hakjin, and by the time she was halfway home, there was already a car rerouting to intercept her. He was at her apartment before she was. She found him in the hallway outside her door, one of his men positioned at the stairwell end of the corridor. And she looked at Hakjin, and he looked at her, and she said, "I'm fine," before he could ask, because she knew the question was right behind his eyes. "Come inside," she said. He did. She told him what happened, word for word, the exact language the man had used. And Hakjin stood in her kitchen, with his arms crossed, and listened without interrupting. And the stillness he projected was the tightest she had ever seen it. Not calm exactly, but control applied with significant force over something that was not calm underneath. When she finished, he said nothing for a moment. Then, "He shouldn't have come near you." "Who is he?" A pause. "Someone who has a grievance with me." "Hakjin." He looked at her. She held his gaze and kept her voice even. "I am not asking for the full story of your life. I know that's not how this works. But I am standing in my own kitchen, and a stranger said my name on a public street, and I need to understand enough to know what I'm dealing with." He uncrossed his arms. He looked at the window, then back at her. "There are people in my industry who believe I have something they want. A particular territory. A particular arrangement. The man today was a message. Pressure, not a threat. Not yet. A pause. But I don't want you near it." "I'm already near it. That's what today was." "I know." Something tightened in his jaw. "That's what I'm going to fix." Over the next 2 weeks, she watched him handle it. Not directly. She wasn't inside those rooms and didn't want to be. But in the way the temperature around him changed, the way his men moved with slightly more urgency, the way certain phone calls happened and Hakjin returned from them with that quality of a person who has resolved something and absorbed the cost of resolving it. He didn't disappear during those 2 weeks. That was what she'd half expected, that the pressure would make him pull back, put distance between them as a form of protection. He did the opposite. He was more present, more deliberate about being where she was, and she understood this was also a form of the possessiveness she'd glimpsed since the beginning, not controlling, but unwilling to leave her unguarded in a situation that he had brought, indirectly, to her door. By Christmas, the thing had resolved. He told her simply, on a quiet evening in her apartment with the tree lights on, and the city silent outside the way it got on holidays, that the situation had been addressed. She asked if everyone was safe. He said yes. She believed him and let it go, because she had learned that was also part of this. Knowing which questions had complete answers and which ones had the only answers she was going to get, and finding a way to live with the difference. What she hadn't expected was what he said next. He had been sitting on her couch, jacket off, and she was beside him with her legs folded under her. And he said, "I want to show you something," and pulled out his phone and turned it toward her. It was a building. Architectural drawings, clean and detailed. A mixed-use development on the north side, the kind of project that was significant in scope and clearly expensive. "I'm partnering on this legitimately," he said. "Real estate development. It's been in process for 2 years." A pause. "The lead architect is leaving the firm. The position needs to be filled by someone with design instincts and project management experience." He looked at her. "I'm not offering you a job because of us. I'm telling you about an opportunity that exists because you told me you left something unfinished, and I think about that." Ava looked at the drawings for a long moment. Her chest was doing something complicated. "Hakjin, I can't take a position connected to your... It's a separate entity. Clean." He held her gaze. "But I understand if the answer is no. I'm not asking you to fold your life into mine. I'm telling you a door is open if you want it." She looked at the drawings again. The clean lines of the plans, the spatial logic of them, the way the design breathed even on a screen. She felt something stir that she hadn't felt professionally in years, something adjacent to the reason she'd wanted to be an architect in the first place, before patience had been declared her weakness. She didn't say yes that night. She sat with it, properly, for 2 weeks, consulted a lawyer independently to verify the separation of the entities, asked questions that Hakjin answered without impatience. And then in January, in the first cold, clear week of a new year, she said yes. She gave her notice at the firm. She started the new role in February, and the work was harder and better than anything she'd done in years, and she came home in the evenings with her mind full of problems she actually wanted to solve, and Hakjin was there most of those evenings, present and unhurried, bringing food or reading across from her, or simply existing in her space, in that way he had that managed to feel like company without requiring anything from her. And she thought sometimes about the white orchid on her desk, and the candlelight at Miravel, and the 7 words Marcus had sent from somewhere she wasn't, and how none of it had been the end it had seemed like at the time. In March, she finally said the thing she'd been arranging quietly inside herself for months. They were in her kitchen, early morning, light coming in flat and pale through the window, and he was drinking coffee, and she was looking at him with the particular kind of attention you gave to things you had decided to keep. And she said, "I love you." And then immediately, before he could respond, "You don't have to say it back right now. I just wanted it to be said." He set the coffee down. He crossed the kitchen in 2 steps, and he put his hand along her jaw, tilting her face up, and he looked at her for a moment, with an expression she had never seen on him before. Open, unguarded, the composure completely set aside, and he said quietly, "I know you didn't need me to, but I do." She pressed her forehead against his collarbone and felt his arms come around her, and she stood in her own kitchen in the March morning light, and understood that some things began in the strangest ways and became the truest ones, that some table set for one turned out to be waiting for something entirely different, and that the wait he had warned her about by the river was real and present and hers now. And she had chosen it. And it was enough. It was more than enough.